I want to welcome everyone to part 3 of the Antebellum South, and we'll be taking a look at slave resistance and uprisings. For, as you would expect, with slavery will come resistance. After all, nobody wants to sit there and be in bondage and work against their will. Now, for the most part, a lot of the resistance was passive resistance. Um, Kind of the idea that slaves refused to maybe work as hard as they could. Perhaps there was acts of sabotage. Maybe you break, your equipment, the things that you're working with, so that it takes time to fix them, repair them, or get a new one or a replaced one, and it just kind of takes away time from working. But as you can see, there was also times where there were active slave insurrections. There are also slave folk tales that tell of using cunning and deceit against their masters. And there's times even where free African Americans will actively be involved in helping fugitive slaves to escape via the Underground Railroad. And with that, we all know obviously of Harriet Tubman, nicknamed Moses, as she led countless number of slaves to freedom, risking her own life to save those that were being oppressed. Now, this was obviously a very difficult and dangerous task, knowing that there'd be a bounty on one's head if you were caught helping runaways. Chances are you'd be, sent back into slavery, whipped, maybe even executed. But obviously, having a high reward in fugitive slave laws that were enacted to allow slave catchers to go and catch the runaway slaves. But rebellions weren't just isolated to the United States. As you can see, they happened throughout the Americas. Even though some may say that the slaves in the United States had a perhaps higher standard of living than those in, say, maybe the Caribbean or Brazil, regardless, slavery is slavery. And obviously, people are going to be trying to rebel against it. And a couple of the more prominent ones that we'll just mention briefly is Denmark Vesey in South Carolina. That was preceded by Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, and then also followed by Nat Turner, also in Virginia. One of the early ones that happened in Virginia in 1800 was Gabriel Prosser on the left, and he was a strong, intelligent slave that was actually allowed to kind of farm himself out for money in the Richmond area. And so, as he did this, it kind of gave him greater freedom and even allowed him to accumulate some money. And he became to come in contact with other slaves and freemen and poor working whites. And eventually, there was planned that a slave rebellion would begin on August 30th of 1800, but because of bad weather, it was postponed. But unfortunately, during that time, a couple of the slaves that were to rebel kind of cracked under pressure and told of this uprising. So it failed to materialize because the people were caught before it actually began, including eventually Gabriel Prosser himself, who was eventually sentenced to death. The next one is Denmark Vesey. Now, in 1822, what sets this case apart a little bit is that Vesey was actually a free, prosperous African American. And the fact that he was willing to give his own life in the struggle for freedom of others. This one taking place in South Carolina. But perhaps the most famous rebellion is Turner's Rebellion, 1831, in Southampton, Virginia. Now, Nat Turner was a religious man who said that he had received visions from the Holy Spirit, kind of leading him what to do. And he couldn't stand slavery, but even more so once his owner had died and he was put in the hands of his new slave owner, a young boy, maybe 10 years of age. And that kind of lit the spark that he just couldn't take it anymore and kind of started to organize this rebellion. And eventually, he does lead this rebellion, of which it will spread a good deal. Not just fear, but it'll spread kind of distance wise throughout several towns throughout Virginia. But eventually, roughly 55 or so whites are killed. Several of the slaves are killed, as well as others that will be executed later, including Nat Turner, after he is caught after hiding out in swamps for some time. But what all these slave rebellions eventually does, or what they do, is it kind of creates more fear and panic. And even slaves that had nothing to do with these rebellions are eventually put to death and executed because they were just assumed to have perhaps an inkling of an uprising, or to be planning some mischievous tasks. And it also leads to further laws, stricter laws, being passed to try to keep the whites, who are minorities in some of the counties in the South, safer. And so these slave rebellions, even though they're unsuccessful, will have a huge impact on the daily lives of slaves. And as I'd said, even though there was some active resistance, passive resistance was the kind of the major way that slaves would kind of rebel. And for these slaves to try to make it through their lives in these horrid conditions, religion did play an important part in the foundation of African American culture. And a lot of times sermons would speak of eventual deliverance from slavery. But slaves did what they could to try to make it through, including expanding their families to where possible, to include others on their plantation, almost like family, even though they weren't blood related. And through all of this, white Southerners start to spread propaganda, about how slavery is better for these African Americans than life back in Africa, because they're treated better, they have better homes, better food, they're Christianized, and taken care of. And so to try to justify, reasons, for slavery, these Southerners, say that since they're giving them Christianity and they're civilizing them, since they treat them better than industries treat their workers up in the North. But the idea of paternalism is kind of another reason or justification for slavery that the South will use. And what paternalism is basically just kind of being a father figure and taking care of them, because the slaves couldn't take care of themselves. But regardless, slaves were looked at as property. It was kind of dehumanizing. And the white Southerners had to kind of justify it to themselves, as well as the rest of the world, as to why slavery was needed. Something that will be eventually taken a look at, the Civil War, which will end it. But that wraps up the antebellum South.